thinking. Now I have an idea.
Let's ride down, and baby, let your mind roll on. Hey.
I think he's pointing that out. And he's going to give another option for life, besides this either or, as Judge William. Let's go to either or, a fragment of life. This is on page 81 of this book. I'm not sure where it is in the original book. Let us now compare an ethical and aesthetic individual. The primary difference, the crux of the matter, is that the ethical individual is transparent to himself and does not live in blauer Hinnen, the wild blue yonder, as does the aesthetic individual. This difference encompasses everything. The person who lives ethically has seen himself, knows himself, penetrates his whole concretion with his consciousness, does not allow vague thoughts to rustle around inside of him, or let tempting possibilities distract him. With their juggling, he is not like a magic picture that shifts from one thing to another, all depending on how one shifts and turns it. He knows himself. The phrase, nosti siafto, know yourself, is a stock phrase, and in it has been perceived the goal of all a person's striving, and this is entirely proper, but yet it is just as certain that he cannot be the goal if it is not also the beginning. The ethical individual knows himself, but this knowing is not simply contemplating, for then the individual comes to be defined according to his necessity. It is a collecting of oneself, which itself is an action, and this is why I have what's a forethought and use the expression to choose oneself instead of to know oneself. So the person who lives his life for society, the ethical person, he doesn't know himself, but he chooses himself. By now you have easily seen that in his life, the ethical individual goes through the stages we previously set forth as separate stages. He is going to develop in his life the personal, the civic, the religious virtues, and his life advances, although he is continually translating himself from one stage to another. As soon as a person thinks that one of these stages is adequate, and that he dares to concentrate on it one-sidedly, he has not chosen himself ethically, but has failed to see the significance of either isolation or continuity, and above all has not grasped the truth lies in the identity of these two. So, I think he's kind of saying, at least to me, that we have to choose both to be isolated and to be continuous, to work in a society, to live alone and be in a society. That's a choice that we make and need to make. So at least the ethical person will make that choice. And finally, we come quickly. I'll just do a little bit of the sickness onto death. He says, this is in the character of Anticlimacus, the pagan and the natural man have merely human self as their criterion. Therefore, from a higher point of view, it may be correct to regard paganism as immersed in sin. But the sin of paganism was essentially despairing ignorance of God, of existing before God. Paganism is to be without God in the world. Therefore, from another point of view, it is true that in the strictest sense the pagan did not sin, for he did not sin before God, and all sin is before God. Furthermore, in one sense it is also quite true that frequently a pagan is assisted in slipping blamelessly through the world simply because he is saved by a superficial Pelagian conception, but then his sin is something certainly also the case. But then his sin is something else, namely his superficial Pelagian interpretation. On the other hand, it is certainly also the case that many a time, precisely by being strictly brought up in Christianity, a person has a certain sense has been plunged into sin because the whole Christian viewpoint was too earnest for him, especially in the early part of his life. But then again, there is some help to him in this more profound conception of what sin is. Sin is before God in despair not to will to be oneself, or before God in despair to will to be oneself. Even though this definition may be in other respects to be conceded to have its merits, and all of them, the most important is that it is the only scriptural definition, for Scripture always defines sin as disobedience. Is not this definition too spiritual? The first and foremost answer to this must be a definition of sin can never be too spiritual. So he's saying that, he's going back to his either-or self here, saying your going to sin because you will to be yourself, or you're going to will not to be yourself. And either way, that's a sin, because any kind of willing before God is a sin. But even worse, even if you don't will before God, you're still sinning, as he makes the point later on here, that sin is hereditary, so it has nothing to do with will at all. That, he says, is the paradox of sin. Christianity begins by taking this path that shows that sin is rooted in willing, and arrives at the concept of defiance, and then, to fasten the end very firmly, it adds the doctrine of hereditary sin. Christianity fastens the end by means of the paradox. I skipped a little bit in there, but so that's the paradox of Christianity, that you are sinning whether you're willing yourself or not willing yourself, because you're willing, and if you don't will, you're still in sin because it's hereditary, so there's no way to get out of it. So that to me is a criticism of Christianity, a very sharp criticism, and the type that he often makes. To sum up, it's not quite true what Sartre said, that he is pushing an existentialist Christianity. The term Christianity would probably be best dropped from Kierkegaard, and I think saying that he is pushing an existentialist love would probably be more proper for Kierkegaard. Thank you, and I will look forward to your thoughts on this.
Won't quiet you, let's ride down, and baby, let your mind